reneged on the Iran nuclear deal and created another crisis with another nuclear aspirant. He's desperate to get a deal with North Korea that he can say is the greatest deal since sliced bread. But that very weakness of that position has so benefited Kim Jong-un. But it's not always possible to divine his motivation, and with respect to Saudi Arabia, it may be financial or it may be other. We're determined to, as a part of our counterintelligence work, make sure that U.S. policy towards the Gulf, whether it's towards Saudi Arabia or UAE or Qatar or anywhere else, is driven by the national interest. And we continue in the committee to examine Saudi Arabia, its role in the peace process, its role in Yemen, its role in the murder of Khashoggi, and we're going to continue to do so.
Wes Blippert, Press Club Wire. About the Intelligence Committee, are you able to work with any kind of unity, as on this, say, on the Senate side? Or, in other words, how's your relationship with Nunes?
Well, it's funny you should ask that question, because we had a hearing yesterday on the topic of going dark. And at the end of the hearing, it was quite interesting, because the members' points of view were all over the map. You could not tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. And at towards the end of the hearing, one of my Republican colleagues said, isn't it nice to have a whole hearing that is not the least bit partisan? And I said, it is wonderful, and let's see if we can get to the end of it without screwing it up, which we did. And, the good news, bad news in terms of our committee over the last 2 years has, I think been, at least the bad news has been plain to see, which is our very profound differences on Russia, and there's no sugarcoating it. We not just view the issue differently, but we view our role differently. From my point of view, our role is to do an objective investigation and to make sure that the country is protected. But from my perspective, they view their role as being the president's defense team. And those roles are incompatible. I'm sure they would view it differently, but that's the perspective I get from how they have approached this. The good news is that on all the other constellation of issues that we've talked about this morning, whether it's Iran or China or whether we're allocating resources properly between the counterterrorism mission and the hard target set, the investments we're making in overhead versus human intelligence versus signals intelligence, all those issues we are working on in a nonpartisan way, and the product of them is the annual intelligence authorization bill, which year after year we have passed out of our committee and passed through the House on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, which I might say, for all the criticism of our committee, and in contrast to the praise of our Senate colleagues, we have been able to do and they haven't. The Senate has not been able to pass an intelligence bill in years. And so that's, I think, the good news, bad news of our committee. I look forward to the day when we can work on the whole constellation of issues in a unified way. But it is difficult to see how that happens vis-a-vis Russia during this presidency or the pendency of this investigation.
I'm working on one I started.
Thanks for being here. So I have two questions. You've mentioned a few times that the FBI has started to answer certain questions about the counterintelligence investigations. I'm wondering how much you can reveal about what kinds of questions they've started to answer, about which topics. I'm also wondering, with regard to the Durham investigation, whether or not you know whether the CIA has compelled its analysts to comply with Durham's questioning, or whether it's voluntary.
Well, the FBI had, began in answering our questions about the counterintelligence investigation, just telling us about process. And this is a formula now that we have seen in other aspects of the Trump administration. When the Government Reform Committee sought to understand who was getting clearances where the agencies had recommended their refusal, their denial. And our own committee looked into this and is looking into this issue as well. All the administration was willing to tell the Government Reform Committee was, this is how the process works, but we're not going to discuss specifics of any particular application or individual. That's useless. Those were the first answers we got on the CI investigation. This is generically how we do a CI investigation. Now, a CI investigation, like a criminal investigation, has a beginning and it has an end. And when it ends, there is a formal ending of that investigation. Whether that process was followed here, we still don't know. Clearly, some, if not all, of the counterintelligence investigation has come to an end, but which parts, whether it all has or some of it, what the conclusions were at the end of any particular element of that, we still don't know. So that is sort of generally where we are, but each week they are providing more information, but it is, like everything else, pulling teeth, and our patience is growing fatigued at this point. That's a bit where we are on the CI information. In terms of the issue of the either the investigation by the Inspector General or Durham's investigation or Bill Barr's investigation, we have very little visibility. I have discussed personally with the Director of National Intelligence, Coates, my profound concern about what Bill Barr is doing in particular, this desire to provide cover for the President by investigating the investigators, this desire to give amplification to the counter-narrative, ignore what the Russians did, ignore what the Russians may do in the next election, focus only on investigating the investigators. And we have already seen, I think, a disturbing erosion of our checks and balances. The effort by the President, for example, to get McCabe fired before his pension would vest, and the decision to initiate that investigation and to accelerate the timetable and reach a result on it so that he could be fired before his pension vested, that tainted that whole investigation. The findings of that investigation by the IG may be perfectly accurate, but it is tainted from the start because it had a political origin from the start. I used to serve on it was called the Democracy Assistance Commission. Now it's a democracy partnership between the Congress and emerging democracies, and we always used to encourage these emerging democracies that when you win an election, you don't seek to jail the losing side. And yet, that's what we find this administration trying to do, to investigate and prosecute the losing side. And once again, the echoes of lock her up were in the air last night. That's now, that ethic is now part of DOJ policy under Barr. Investigate your rivals. And the only other thing I would add to me, which was among the most dangerous changes along these lines, is when Bill Barr testified that the President could have made the Mueller investigation go away anytime he chose if he thought it unfair. What president would think an investigation into his or her corruption was anything but unfair? That view of the top law enforcement officer in the land doesn't make the President above the law. It means the President is the law. And I can't imagine any more dangerous view of an Attorney General than that one. It also means, by the way, that these other dozen or 14 investigations that Mueller spun off to other elements of the Department of Justice, presumably the President could also make go away if he thought they were unfair. That's why I believe that Bill Barr is the second most dangerous person in the country right now.
Here on the second row.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Hamburger, Washington Post. Two-part question, if I may. You spoke at the earlier about the threat to U.S. elections that might come from specifically the Russians going forward. I wondered if you and the Intelligence Committee have concern about similar initiatives that might come from other foreign powers, and if you could specify that concern. Also, given the concerns you raised about Saudi Arabia, I wanted to ask specifically whether the Saudis or their allies in the Middle East might be a matter of concern for that interference. Second, if I may, I wanted to ask about your priority that you set on looking at Trump Tower Moscow. What else is there to learn, given the reports we've had from the Mueller report, going into it in some detail? Why is this a matter of priority for the Intelligence Committee?
Yeah. Well, let me start with the issue of whether other countries may also have an interest in interfering in the 2020 election. I think that the aperture has been opened for other foreign meddling in our affairs. And what's more, the model has been made now for domestic bad actors to employ some of the same tactics. So the risk that I mentioned from deep fakes is not just a foreign risk. Obviously, domestic bad actors can do it, and I don't know the precise origin of the cheap fake involving Speaker Pelosi. That may have had a domestic origin. So the risk, I think, is now quite widespread because the Russians have shown just how easy it is. And in fact, even in the last election, even in the midterms, we saw people experimenting in Alabama with the use of false flag operations, these phony personas online, as a way of manipulating voter sentiment. So is it possible, plausible, probable that other actors like Iran, for example, might decide that it wants to mess with us as a way of fighting back asymmetrically? It's certainly possible. In terms of China, I think the administration has often conflated two different kinds of influence in an effort to take the focus off of Russia when the administration talks about China and China's effort to influence the public. It will talk about the Chinese use of tariffs, strategically to get the president's attention in places that he cares deeply about. That's quite overt. Or they'll talk about China writing op-eds in newspapers or engaging in diplomatic encounters. I think that's a far cry from a hacking and dumping operation. So I don't anticipate that the Chinese are going to use the same kind of tactics the Russians did. But other countries certainly may. The North Koreans, for example, have demonstrated a willingness to hack Sony over a far less important issue, a bad movie. So I do think other nations will view this as a relatively low-risk, potential high-gain opportunity. And, the more profound concern I think we have over some of these other actors comes with respect to our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure. And so we obviously closely monitor that as well. In terms of Saudi or other nations, there have been allegations involving Gulf powers and intervention, for example, involving Jeff Bezos as a way of punishing the president's enemies or rewarding his friends. Whether those allegations are accurate or inaccurate, there is always that risk. And that risk is accentuated when the president seems to say, there's nothing wrong with that, everybody does it. I think it only encourages that kind of thing. And I'm sorry, you had a second question? Trump Tower Moscow. Trump Tower Moscow. We would like to present a fuller account of Trump Tower Moscow because that remains such a potentially compromising circumstance. If the president continues to want to make that deal, then our policy continues to be held hostage by the profit-making incentive there. So I think getting out as much information ultimately about the efforts to build that tower will be salutary by shedding a spotlight on it. But I hold up that merely as the example, frankly, of why we need to be concerned about a whole constellation of counterintelligence issues. That's just the most tangible. It was going to be the tallest tower in all of Europe. It's hard to get more tangible than that. But there are other issues that we are looking into as well. If there was a change in U.S. policy owing to the need to refinance certain real estate, that's a problem. And so there are other counterintelligence issues and problems that we're also examining.
Hi, Congressman Schiff. Thanks for being here. So in the context of Trump seeming to show some willingness to accepting foreign information, Republicans countered with what the Clinton campaign did with hiring Fusion GPS, foreign opposition research firm, to then hire ex-British spy Christopher Steele to compile a dossier using Kremlin sources, and then the FBI using that information in an investigation, using it in FISA applications, it possibly containing Russian disinformation, being unverified and that sort of thing. So do you consider that to be foreign influence in any way? And when we recommend when you recommend to campaigns that they not accept foreign information, would you also recommend that campaigns and campaign vendors not seek out foreign information as well in the next campaign?
Well, I think this is an illustration of a tactic the administration and its allies often use, which is the argument of false equivalence, the sort of whataboutism. Yes, the president called on Russia to hack his opponent's emails and said they'd be richly rewarded by the press, and hours later they attempted to do exactly that. But what about the fact that the DNC hired Fusion GPS? Well, Fusion GPS is an American firm. Now, Fusion GPS did hire Christopher Steele, who's a foreign national. And there are rules about what role foreign nationals can play in any campaign. Rules which I think probably the closer analogy is the Trump campaign's use of Cambridge Analytica and its employment of foreign nationals at Cambridge Analytica, and whether those foreign nationals were exercising a degree of control in the campaign that violated the campaign prohibition on the use of foreign nationals. That's probably the better analogy. In the case of the DNC and Fusion GPS, they appeared to have abided by the rules. In the case of Cambridge Analytica, it appears they violated the rules. But I don't think there's any equivalence between hiring an American opposition research firm, even one that hires a former British intelligence officer to do some of its opposition research, and having a direct contact with people in the Russian government to get dirt on your opponent as part of what's described as that foreign nation's effort to help your campaign. That seems to me a very, very different qualitatively and far more problematic. But I think this is, yet another effort to deflect and blur the distinctions and say, well, everybody does it. Everybody doesn't do it. When the president says that, I think he is merely projecting his own lack of ethics onto others, which we have seen repeatedly.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions.
Hi, I want to ask about Iran, and particularly just how confident you are in the intelligence, because there are questions that people have going back to WMDs that intelligence sometimes is wrong. And secondly, sort of a follow-on to that, we have senators. Yesterday, Senator Lindsey Graham said one of the things that's under consideration is potentially attacking Iranian oil assets, taking away their ability to refine oil. Wondering what you think about that sort of strike in response to some of these attacks.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's always a risk that sources of intelligence can be wrong or the analysis can be wrong. I think the intelligence is pretty strong here that Iran is responsible for these attacks. The navigation, though, the shipping needs to be protected. And you can make an argument that even if you didn't know who was responsible, you need to protect the shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz from any bad actor. I also think that this, as I mentioned earlier, needs to be an effort that we don't embark on alone. This should not be the United States trying to police the Strait of Hormuz on its own. This should not be the United States taking unilateral action because of Iranian or other attacks on international shipping. This needs to be done in concert with our allies. And I think we are seeing the dangers of a policy of going it alone, of castigating and alienating our allies, that when we need our allies, as we do right now, they're nowhere to be found. And so I think this really calls for an international effort to protect shipping and to deter any further attacks. I would also say on the question of the U.S. attacking Iran as a response, as Senator Cotton and others have advocated, that is not something within the authority of the administration to do on its own. That would require an authorization from Congress. The authorizations that are outstanding do not apply in any way, shape, or form to these circumstances. We're not talking about those responsible for 9/11 here. We're not talking about Iraq. And so I firmly disagree with those that are suggesting that somehow these prior authorizations or Article 2 cover this. They don't. And I think it would be a tragic escalation on our part to act unilaterally, to act without the consent of Congress, to take steps that just further drive us from our allies or provoke an even greater counterreaction from Iran.
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in here because you say our allies are nowhere to be found, but Secretary Pompeo is right now going to the Middle East and then to Europe to talk about these very issues. Do you think that's the right thing to do? Do you think he'll get support?
Well, I think it's the right thing for him to try. And the fact, though, that we have been so unsuccessful at this point when ships have been attacked in such flagrant way is a testament to how much we have alienated those allies. I attended the Munich National Security Conference with a large contingent, Democratic and Republican, led by the speaker. And you could tell from the reaction when we interacted with our foreign counterparts how alienated we are from our allies. One conversation I had with a head of state coincided with a presidential tweet that said, "Hey, Europe, you better take those foreign fighters from Syria. Otherwise, I'm just going to order them released, and good luck with that." And this foreign leader said to us, "Is this how you treat your ally now? There's no contact between your head of state and ours. There's no engagement between your secretary of state and ours. We have to get threatened on Twitter." And when you treat your allies that way, and this is one of our allies, and then you have a situation like this, a crisis where shipping is being detonated in the Gulf, why should we be surprised when they don't come rushing to join us? And this is, I think, what Secretary Pompeo is encountering. This is the secretary that, effectively, I guess, I don't know the diplomatic word for crashed an effort by Europe to deal with the Iran situation previously, now complaining that Iran may leave the agreement. When Iran warned the administration, this was exactly the course it was setting. And, again, Iran is a sponsor of terror. Iran is a uniquely malevolent actor. Iran has no right, no need for either nuclear energy or a nuclear bomb. And it would be catastrophic if they get one. But this confrontation that we're in now was so eminently predictable, and that it has made it enormously hard for us to marshal the kind of international support that we should.
Okay, I'm sorry. I know there are more questions, but we are out of time. So thank you very much, Congressman, for being here.
Thank you very much.